My son sold my $12 million Miami waterfront estate while I was lying unconscious in a hospital bed, fighting for my life after heart surgery. He thought he was clever, thought that a shaky forgery of my signature would be enough to strip me of everything I had built. He didn't know that my late wife had built protections he could never untangle. He didn't know that while he celebrated his new life of luxury, the ground beneath him was already giving way. I stayed silent. I waited, and I prepared the gift that would destroy him at the very height of his arrogance. Before I begin, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The first thing I remember after the surgery was light, not the warm golden light that bounced off the waves of Biscayne Bay through my glass windows, but a cold, sterile light that hummed above me. Then came the sound, a machine's slow, insistent beeping, a rhythm counting out the seconds of a life I wasn't sure still belonged to me. My chest ached with every breath, a dull, crushing weight that pinned me to the hospital bed. I tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, and then I saw his face, my son Daniel, hovering too close, too eager. His wife, Marissa, clutched my hand like it was hers to own, her sharp rings biting into my fragile skin. "Dad, you scared us half to death," Daniel said, his voice pitched louder than it needed to be, dripping with practiced concern. "But don't worry, everything's been taken care of." Those words should have soothed me, but after 70 years of life and 4 decades as a forensic accountant, I'd learned the truth. Reassurance was often a mask for deceit. My late wife, Helena, had always told me, "Ethan, never trust words. Trust actions." Daniel's words were syrup, but his eyes darted too quickly, and Marissa's smile was too bright, too forced. I closed my eyes as though exhaustion had overtaken me, but in truth I was awake inside, watching, listening, remembering every detail. For a week I drifted between morphine dreams and heavy silences. When I finally returned home, I thought stepping into my estate would heal me. Instead, it felt like stepping into a stranger's house. The scent of salt and mangroves clung to the air, but the rooms were bare of warmth. Helena's little sculptures, the ones she had collected from every trip we ever took, were missing from the mantel. The hall smelled faintly of fresh paint, like someone had scrubbed the life out of my home. Daniel carried my bags, avoiding my gaze. A paper slipped from his briefcase, a folded appraisal stamped with my address. My eyes froze on the number at the bottom. $12,000. My estate had been valued, but why? I tucked the paper into my pocket, my face unreadable. He didn't know I'd seen it, and that was my advantage. That night, the quiet hum of the house felt wrong. I had lived there for decades, through storms and hurricanes, through Helena's laughter and the silence that followed after I buried her. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of something missing. Marissa bustled through the kitchen, her voice chirping about how they had cleaned everything up so I wouldn't have to worry anymore. She opened cabinets, pointed to neatly stacked glasses, spoke of how simplified things had become. Her tone was cheerful, but every word scraped across me like sandpaper. Simplified meant stripped. Simplified meant prepared. Simplified meant I was no longer the master of my own home, only a guest in a life they were arranging without me. Daniel lingered by the living room window, his back to me, his phone glowing against the glass. He was whispering into it, sharp, urgent fragments of sentences that cut off when I shifted in my chair. "Dad, you should rest," he said too quickly, slipping the phone into his pocket. His voice was sugar, but his hands trembled slightly when he poured himself a drink. I leaned back, feigning weakness, letting my eyelids droop as though fatigue had defeated me. But inside, I was wide awake. 40 years in finance had trained me to watch the smallest tells, the misplaced decimal, the nervous glance, the figures that didn't add up. My son thought my body was broken, that I was too weak to see. He didn't know my mind was sharper than it had ever been, sharpened by betrayal, honed by suspicion. As I lay in bed later that night, the rhythmic lap of the bay against the seawall no longer soothed me. It sounded like a clock ticking down, measuring the seconds until something inevitable. My chest tightened, not from surgery this time, but from the cold, deliberate thought growing inside me. Daniel had done something enormous. Memories of Helena's words returned to me. "Ethan, always look at what people do, not what they say." Daniel's words were all love and devotion, but his actions reeked of preparation. Marissa's words were busy, distracting, filling silence with cheerful clutter, but her eyes flicked toward me too often, gauging my strength, testing if I still had any fight left in me. I rolled onto my side, staring at the wall where Helena's favorite painting once hung. It was gone, replaced by a hollow stretch of pale paint. That emptiness told me everything I needed to know. My son wasn't preparing to care for me. He was preparing to bury me, not in the ground, but under a life he had stolen piece by piece. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dark, not to him, not to her, but to myself. Not yet, Daniel. Not yet. A week later, they drove me back to the house that Helena and I had poured our souls into. Only stepping through the door felt like trespassing in a place that used to be mine. The bay shimmered outside. The skyline glittered in the distance. But inside the walls were too white, too sterile, too staged. It was the kind of tidiness you only see in a property staged for buyers, not in a home where people live and breathe and argue and love. Marissa walked beside me, her voice skipping over details I never asked for. The cleaning service they'd hired, the little updates they'd made to make things easier. But easier for whom? Her hands fluttered as she spoke, her rings catching the light as though they wanted to blind me from the truth. Daniel, meanwhile, lugged my bag in silence, his shoulders tight, his phone buzzing endlessly. As he bent to pick up another suitcase from the car, I saw it again. A slip of paper floating to the driveway like a feather. I stooped slowly, my chest aching with the effort, and picked it up. My name, my address, bold across the top. An appraisal report, $12 million. The world seemed to tilt, the edges of my vision going white for a moment. Why would my son need an appraisal of my property? Why would it be sitting loose in his briefcase like a receipt? I folded the paper slowly, my hands steady, though my heart pounded against the fragile cage of my ribs. I slid it into my pocket without a word. He didn't notice. That night, I sat alone in my office, the room dim except for the pale glow of my computer screen. My fingers trembled on the keyboard, not from weakness, but from rage, kept under iron control. I typed in my own address on Zillow, then Redfin, one site after another, searching, and then I saw it. There was my estate, my Helena's masterpiece, photographed from perfect angles in golden Miami sunsets. Every room polished and captured in high resolution, smiling at strangers. And next to it, in brutal red letters, sold. The date mocked me. 3 days after my surgery, when I had been unconscious, tubes in my body, machines keeping me alive. While I hovered at the edge of death, Daniel had signed my name and sold my life's work out from under me. I didn't shout. I didn't weep. The fire I expected never came. Instead, a cold calm spread through me, glacial and unyielding. This was no misunderstanding. This was not a desperate mistake. This was a calculated theft by my own blood. I leaned back in my chair, my breathing slow, my heart steady. I wasn't a patient anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was what I had always been, an investigator. Daniel had closed a door. I was about to open a case. Sleep became impossible that night. The rhythmic sound of the bay outside my window, once a lullaby, now pounded against me like a metronome, marking every second stolen from my life. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind running numbers like I had done for 40 years as a forensic accountant. Only this time, the numbers weren't on a client's ledger. They were carved into my bones, bleeding through my chest with every heartbeat. 12 million, 3 days, a forged signature. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake the house that no longer felt like mine. My footsteps were slow but deliberate as I made my way to the office. The glow of the computer screen cast shadows across the walls, familiar walls that suddenly felt foreign. My fingers hovered above the keyboard before I began. Property records in Miami-Dade County were public. I had navigated those systems countless times in my career, unraveling corporate frauds that thought they were too clever to be caught. Tonight, I turned that same expertise against my own blood. I entered the parcel number, one Helena and I had memorized when we first bought the land all those years ago, a string of numbers that had once meant the beginning of a dream. The page loaded. The documents appeared. There it was, stamped in black and white, a notarized deed of transfer. The buyer was listed as a numbered LLC, nothing unusual, just another mask for a wealthy man who wanted his name hidden until the ink dried. My eyes slid lower to the line that mattered most, the seller's signature. It was my name, my own name, sprawled in uneven strokes across the paper. The E looped incorrectly, the T too shallow, the H jagged. It was me, and yet not me, the hand of someone who thought an old man's trembling could be imitated with enough practice, A forgery. A pathetic one. My chest tightened, but not with fear, with fury. They had waited until I was under anesthesia, tubes in my veins, my body carved open and vulnerable. They had shoved a power of attorney form in front of me when I was too weak to fight, and then they had stolen everything Helena and I had built. They hadn't just taken a house. They had signed me out of my own life. I leaned back, staring at the screen. My son believed he had buried me in the same moment he carved up my estate. He believed I was too frail, too broken, too near death to ever notice. He was wrong. The betrayal was complete, but so was my resolve. He had made his move. Now it was my turn. My hand hovered over the phone for a long time that night. Every instinct of a father screamed at me to dial Daniel, to demand an explanation, to pour out my rage like a storm tearing through the walls. But that wasn't who I was. I wasn't ruled by rage. Rage blinds you. Rage makes you sloppy. And I had spent a lifetime studying how people hide lies in numbers, how truth only reveals itself when you move carefully, patiently, deliberately. So instead of calling my son, I called an old friend. His number had been etched into my memory since the days when we worked side by side on corporate fraud cases, me on the accounting side, him on the enforcement side, when It picked up. His voice was older, gravelly, but sharp as ever. "David Monroe," he said, his tone alert, professional, the same as it had always been. "It's Ethan," I replied, my voice steady. There was a pause, followed by a warmth that cut through the chill in my chest. "Ethan, my God, I heard about your surgery. How are you holding up?" "The doctors say I'm fine," I said, skipping past the pleasantries. "But I have a situation, a professional one." David had once been with the FBI, the kind of agent who could dismantle a Ponzi scheme with nothing more than a yellow notepad and a pen. He didn't waste time. His voice shifted instantly, the warmth gone, replaced with razor focus. "Go ahead." I laid it all out, not as a father betrayed, but as if I were presenting a case file. I described the hospital, the false reassurances, the missing possessions in the house, the appraisal I'd found, the records I had pulled, the forged signature that looked like a child's imitation of mine. Every word was precise, clinical. By the end, the silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. When David finally spoke, his voice was grim. "Ethan, this isn't just family drama. This is federal. We're looking at wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, elder fraud. Your medical condition during the transaction makes it airtight. A prosecutor would salivate over this." "I know," I said quietly. "What's my next move?" "Your next move is to do nothing," he snapped. "Not a word to Daniel, not a word to Marissa. As of now, you're the victim in an active investigation, even if we're the only two who know it. Play weak, play old, make them believe you're blind to it all, and in the meantime, you build. Documents, bank statements, anything you can find about the estate. Every scrap of paper Helena ever kept. Do it quietly. You can't let them see you searching." His words hit hard, but they were truth. In Daniel's mind, I was already gone, a guest in a house he thought was his. He was wrong. I wasn't gone. I was watching, and I was preparing. After my call with David, I sat in the dark for a long time, the phone heavy in my hand. The house was silent, the kind of silence that swallows you whole. But beneath it, I felt a strange strength returning. For the first time since my surgery, I wasn't drifting helplessly through someone else's plan. I was charting my own course, one careful step at a time. The first thing I needed was evidence. Numbers don't lie, documents don't vanish, and Helena, God bless her meticulous soul, never threw away a single piece of paper that might matter someday. I remembered her sitting at this very desk late into the night, reading contracts line by line while I teased her for being too cautious. She would just smile and say, "The fine print is where the truth hides, Ethan." At the time I thought she was simply a worrier. Now I realized she had been a prophet. I began small, cautious. I requested 6 months of bank statements from my accounts, claiming I needed them for personal tax records. I searched through email archives for anything Daniel might have slipped into my inbox without me noticing. I rifled through old filing cabinets, flipping past property tax bills, insurance documents, mortgage payoffs. Every scrap told a piece of the story. But I had to move. Slowly, carefully. Daniel dropped by more often than usual, his visits filled with forced cheer and shallow questions. "How's the chest, Dad? Need anything? Should I call the nurse?" His voice was a mask, but his eyes betrayed him. They flicked toward my office door too often, like he was afraid of what I might find in there. I made sure he never saw the papers I kept tucked under a loose board in the floor. Marissa was no better. She hovered, her perfume trailing into every room, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. She smiled too brightly, asked if I was comfortable, if the sheets were warm enough, but her eyes, sharp and restless, always lingered on my desk, on the locked drawer she didn't have a key for. I played my role. I leaned heavier on my cane. I let my voice waver. I pretended to drift off in mid-sentence, my eyelids fluttering like I was losing strength. Let them think they were winning. Let them believe the lion had grown too old to bite. But behind those tired eyes I was building my case. Each receipt, each signature, each record was another brick in the wall I was quietly raising between myself and their betrayal. They thought they had buried me. What they didn't know was that Helena had already built my resurrection. Days blurred into one another as I gathered fragments of my life, piecing them together in secret. Daniel and Marissa floated in and out of the house like landlords checking on a tenant, their smiles stretched too tight, their laughter brittle and hollow. They believed they had already won, that I was nothing more than a frail old man shuffling through the last days of his life. But I knew better. Every evening when they left, I stayed awake, sorting through boxes, reading through files, digging for the one thing Helena had always promised me existed: protection. She used to say it with such quiet certainty. "Ethan, you'll never be alone. Even if I go first, I'll make sure you're safe." At the time, I thought it was a widow's romantic vow, words meant to comfort me against the fear of losing her. But now, those words felt like a map. Somewhere in this house was the fortress she had built out of paper, ink, and law. It was just after midnight when I found it, behind a row of dusty accounting textbooks on the top shelf of my office. My fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled the books aside, and there it was. A fireproof safe, small but heavy, its dial lock familiar beneath my fingertips. My breath caught in my throat. Daniel didn't know this existed. I had never told him. The combination came back to me slowly, a sequence Helena had whispered to me years ago on the night she insisted we buy the safe. I turned the dial, listening for the clicks, each one sounding like a heartbeat echoing in the silent room. The door opened with a soft groan. Inside were Helena's treasures, not jewelry or keepsakes, but something far more powerful. Neat stacks of documents bound in legal blue covers, deeds, contracts, surveys, mortgage releases, trust agreements, the entire history of our estate from the day we bought the land until the last renovation. Each folder was labeled in her elegant handwriting. At the very bottom lay a thick binder with a yellowed label that read, "Elliott Family Irrevocable Trust." My hands trembled as I lifted it out. I sat down at my desk, the weight of it grounding me, and began to read. Page after page revealed the careful, almost prophetic foresight of my wife. She had separated the land from the house, structured ownership through the trust, and woven in clauses that I barely understood at first glance. But what I did understand was this: Daniel's theft was not as complete as he believed. I leaned back in my chair, the sound of the bay echoing faintly through the open window. For the first time since discovering the forged deed, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself in weeks: hope. I spent the next 2 hours hunched over the desk, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over Helena's papers. Each page was another piece of her mind, a glimpse into how far ahead she had been thinking, while I was busy earning, building, and trusting that family meant loyalty. She had seen the shadows I refused to acknowledge. She had prepared for the kind of betrayal I could never imagine from our own blood. The trust agreement was thick, written in legal language that most men would have ignored, but I had lived with Helena long enough to understand her patterns. She had highlighted clauses, scribbled notes in the margins in her neat handwriting. One sentence leapt out at me like a beacon. "The trust shall retain sole ownership of the land in perpetuity. My estate, the priceless strip of waterfront on which my house stood, was not in my name. It never had been. It belonged to the trust Helena created, and I was only the lifetime beneficiary." The second discovery was even more devastating for Daniel's scheme. The house itself, the walls, the glass, the structure, was legally a separate entity. That, and only that, had been in my name. That was what Daniel had forged my signature to sell. But he hadn't touched the land beneath it. He couldn't. Helena had locked it inside the trust, like a treasure chest that no one could open without her key. And then came the masterpiece. Folded neatly in the back of the binder was a slim document labeled ground lease. 99 years. Rent. $1 per year. The trust had leased the land to me as the owner of the structure. A clause in the lease caught my eye. my pulse quickening as I read it again and again. Any unauthorized transfer of the structure shall immediately void the lease. That was it. That was the kill shot Helena had left behind. By forging my signature and selling the house, Daniel had unknowingly detonated a time bomb. The lease was void, which meant the building he sold, the building the buyer thought he had purchased, was now an illegal trespasser sitting on land still protected by the trust. I closed the binder and leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. I could almost see Helena there, smiling at me with that calm, knowing look she always wore when she was 5 steps ahead. My chest ached, but it wasn't from the surgery this time. It was from the overwhelming mixture of grief and gratitude, loss and relief. Daniel thought he had stolen everything. He didn't realize he had only stolen an empty shell. My wife had protected the heart of it all. By the time dawn broke, the binder was still open in front of me, its pages dog-eared and marked with Helena's annotations. My eyes burned from reading, but my mind had never felt clearer. I knew the broad strokes, but I needed confirmation. I needed someone who could dissect the legal intricacies Helena had left behind and turn them into a weapon sharp enough to cut through every lie Daniel had spun. There was only one person I trusted with that task, my niece, Claire Whitmore. She was Helena's sister's daughter, a corporate lawyer in New York with a reputation for dismantling billion-dollar deals before the ink was dry. Helena adored her, said she had inherited both her sharp mind and her ruthless sense of justice. I hadn't spoken to Claire in months, but I knew without question she would come. I picked up the phone and dialed. She answered on the second ring, her voice brisk, polished, already sounding like a courtroom. "Claire Whitmore." "It's your Uncle Ethan," I said, my tone steady but urgent. A pause. Then her voice softened instantly. "Uncle Ethan, I heard about your surgery. Are you all right?" "I'm alive," I told her, "but I need you here in Miami immediately. It's about Helena's trust. It's urgent." The weight in my voice must have carried through the line because she didn't hesitate. "I'll be on the first flight. Send me the details." True to her word, Claire arrived the next afternoon. When she walked into the living room, she carried none of the sympathy of a relative visiting an ailing uncle. She moved like a litigator entering a deposition, her dark hair pulled back, her briefcase snapping shut as she set it on the coffee table. Her eyes scanned me quickly, then locked onto the green metal box I had placed in the center of the room. "That's everything Helena left," I said, sliding the binder toward her. Claire slipped off her blazer, rolled up her sleeves, and leaned forward. For hours she read, page after page, barely looking up. She scribbled notes in the margins of her legal pad, cross-referenced dates, and occasionally let out a low whistle of admiration. The sun dipped lower outside the bay windows, painting the water gold, but neither of us moved. Finally, she closed the binder with a decisive thud and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes, sharp and bright, met mine. "Uncle Ethan," she said softly, "your wife was a fortress. Daniel didn't sell your estate. That fool only sold the building." The words hung in the air like a verdict. At first, I thought I had misheard her. The exhaustion from a sleepless night weighed on me, and my mind struggled to catch up to her words. "Only the building?" I asked slowly, my voice hoarse. Claire leaned forward, her eyes flashing with the satisfaction of someone who had just uncovered a masterpiece. She spread the papers across the coffee table, arranging them into neat piles like evidence in a courtroom. "Yes, let me break this down for you, Uncle Ethan. What Helena did here was extraordinary." She tapped the thick trust agreement with her pen. "The land, this prime Miami waterfront property worth about 8 million chirotzons, in its own, isn't yours. It never was. It belongs to the Elliott family irrevocable trust. That means no one, not even you, can sell it. You are simply the lifetime beneficiary, entitled to live here until your last breath." She slid a second stack of documents forward, the deed for the physical house. "Now this structure, the glass and concrete mansion itself, was held in your personal name. That is what Daniel forged your signature to sell. He transferred ownership of a building, nothing more. Without the land, it's just an empty shell." My pulse quickened as the truth began to sink in. She wasn't done. Claire reached for the thin ground lease and held it up between her fingers. "And this? This is Helena's masterstroke. 99 years, $1 a year in rent, signed between the trust and you as the owner of the structure. It gave you the legal right to have the house on trust land. But here's the brilliance. Clause 7. Any unauthorized transfer of the structure immediately voids the lease. The second Daniel sold this house behind your back, the lease was nullified." I blinked, stunned. "So what does that mean?" Claire's lips curled into a smile that was both triumphant and cold. It means the buyer, whoever Daniel suckered into paying $12 million, has purchased a mansion that is now trespassing on land he does not own and has no legal right to occupy. Legally, it's worthless. Worse than worthless. It's a liability. The room was quiet, except for the steady crash of the waves outside. My heart thudded in my chest, not from weakness this time, but from a dawning sense of awe. Helena hadn't just built a home, she had built a fortress of law and foresight. She had protected me from the very betrayal I had refused to believe could ever happen. Daniel thought he had won. He thought he had buried me, but he had only managed to dig his own grave. The weight of Helena's brilliance pressed down on me as Claire sat back, folding her arms with a satisfied expression. For years I had teased my wife for her endless caution, her habit of reading contracts at midnight with a magnifying glass, her refusal to sign anything without triple-checking the details. Now I understood. She had been playing a game I hadn't even realized existed, not just protecting our property, but protecting me from the very bloodline that would one day turn against me. Claire leaned forward again, her tone all business. We can't let this sit. The longer that buyer believes he owns something, the more he'll try to assert control. We need to strike now. What do you mean? I asked, though I already sensed the answer. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her legal pad and began to write, her pen scratching across the page with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. A notice, not emotional, not personal, strictly legal. It will inform him that his purchase was fraudulent, that his so-called mansion is now an illegal trespasser on Elliott Family Trust property, and that he is required to remove it. It'll be a declaration of war, Uncle Ethan, but one we can win without lifting a finger. I watched her work, the letters forming neat, lethal sentences. Each one was stripped of emotion, but together they cut deeper than any outburst ever could. She attached copies of the trust agreement, the lease, the deed, each document, a weapon sharpened by Helena's foresight. When she was done, she slid the draft across the table to me. I read it slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I held the pages. The language was calm, clinical, almost cold. It didn't scream or accuse. It simply stated facts: the fraudulent conveyance, the forged signature, the irrevocable trust, the voided lease. At the end, it delivered its devastating blow. The buyer had 60 days to vacate the land, to remove the structure at his own expense, or face legal action. I set the papers down, staring at them in silence. My son's betrayal had left me hollow, stripped bare of trust and warmth. But in this moment, I felt something return. Resolve. Power. Claire met my eyes. Do you want me to send it? I nodded once. Yes. The letter was printed on thick, cream-colored stationery. She signed her name in bold ink and placed it into a certified envelope. As she sealed it, I realized that for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting back. 4 days later, the phone rang. Claire put it on speaker so we could both hear. The voice on the other end was slick, polished, and dripping with condescension. Ms. Whitmore, this is Richard Klein, counsel for Mr. Jonathan Mercer, he began, his tone slow and deliberate, the kind of voice meant to intimidate. My client received your letter. He found it creative. But let's not waste time. We both know what this is. A pathetic shakedown. An old man and his desperate lawyer niece trying to squeeze a few more dollars out of a man of means. It won't work. I clenched my jaw, but before I could speak, Claire raised a hand. She didn't even flinch. Counselor, she said, her voice calm, almost bored, I suggest you reread the documents we provided. This isn't a negotiation. It's a notification. Your client does not own the land. He never did. The fraudulent sale voided the lease. His $12 million mansion is now nothing more than an illegal structure trespassing on Elliott Family Trust property. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear Klein's smirk falter before he chuckled dismissively. Cute, but let's be serious. You expect us to believe a court will side with you? You expect a judge to throw my client out of his own home because of some obscure clause in a dusty trust? Claire's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. I don't expect it. I know it. And if you doubt that, feel free to ignore our notice. You have 56 days remaining. After that, we'll file suit not only to have the structure removed, but to collect damages. and regarding Mr. Elliott's condition, we have sworn affidavits from his cardiologist confirming he was unconscious when those documents were signed. Any claim of good faith on your client's part evaporates the moment those are filed. Silence. Then a scoff. You're bluffing. Try me, Claire said coldly, and when you do, make sure your client understands that elder fraud isn't a civil inconvenience. It's a federal offense. He didn't buy a mansion, counselor. He bought a problem, and it's about to cost him dearly. She ended the call with a sharp tap before he could respond. The room was quiet, the waves outside muffled by the thick glass windows. Claire leaned back, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with a quiet fire. I sat in my chair, a slow breath leaving my chest. My son had underestimated me. Mercer's lawyer had underestimated her. They all had. But I knew better now. The storm had already begun. While Claire managed the civil battle, David handled the criminal front with the quiet precision of a man who had spent decades dismantling cons. Using his old contacts, he secured a subpoena for Daniel's bank records. The day the envelope arrived, I felt the same thrill I had once felt when cracking open a company's books and finding the lie hidden in plain sight. Numbers don't lie. They can be dressed up, shuffled around, disguised under layers of transactions, but they always leave a trail. We spread the statements across my dining room table, page after page, the neat columns of deposits and withdrawals forming a map of betrayal. And then there it was, a single wire transfer dated the day of my surgery, $12 million deposited into a new account under Daniel's name. I leaned closer, my breath catching as I traced the numbers with a trembling finger. The ink was sharp, undeniable, permanent. He hadn't even tried to hide the initial deposit. After that, yes, he moved it around. A few transfers to different accounts, some shuffled into Marissa's name, others disguised as payments for consulting services or investments. But the origin was clear. $12 million, the exact amount of the fraudulent sale, pouring into his hands while I lay cut open on an operating table. From there, the money flowed like a river feeding his arrogance. $500,000 to wipe out old debts, a few $100,000 to Marissa's personal accounts, her spending sprees leaving trails of luxury boutiques and jewelers, and then the crown jewel. A down payment of nearly $4 million on a mansion in Coral Gables, complete with an infinity pool, marble floors, and a wine cellar stocked with bottles he couldn't even pronounce. I felt my chest tighten, not from weakness, but from a cold fury. This wasn't a son building a life. This was a vulture feasting on the heart of his father. David, ever the professional, pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a flowchart. Arrows, boxes, accounts. Every dollar traced, every transfer documented. It was the story of Daniel's betrayal written in black ink and undeniable math. "This is it," David said, his voice low but certain. "This is the smoking gun. The forged deed was one thing, but this is the money trail. Prosecutors love money trails. They're clean, they're simple, and juries understand them." I stared at the neat columns of betrayal until the numbers blurred before my eyes. My son had thought he could launder his crime into legitimacy, but all he had done was write his confession in dollars and cents. The evidence was no longer scattered fragments. It was becoming a weapon, and soon it would be sharp enough to cut him down. The next week passed in a blur of quiet work. Claire transformed my office into something between a war room and a courtroom, while David brought over boxes of case files from his days with the Bureau to use as templates. Together, we built what would become our arsenal. The forged deed was the opening strike. Side by side, we laid out comparisons of my authentic signature and the clumsy imitation Daniel had scrawled across the transfer papers. The differences were obvious, undeniable, and damning. Where my hand was steady, his was jagged. Where my letters curved with decades of repetition, his wavered with the hesitation of a thief pretending to be an old man. Next came the financials. My meticulous flowcharts traced every dollar of the $12 million, from the fraudulent deposit to the debts he paid off, to Marissa's shopping sprees, to the down payment on the Coral Gables mansion. It was a perfect roadmap of greed, complete with timestamps and transaction IDs that prosecutors could use to walk a jury step by step through the crime. Then came the medical section. Claire secured a sworn affidavit from my surgeon, Dr. Patel, confirming in painstaking detail that at the time of the deed signing, I had been unconscious, hooked up to life support machines, incapable of making so much as a grocery list, let alone authorizing the sale of my estate. My medical records told the story of a man on the edge of death, and a son who had used that moment to carve away his inheritance before I was even buried. Finally, David compiled the legal framework. He drafted a concise summary of every statute Daniel had broken: state charges of forgery and financial elder abuse, federal charges of wire fraud and identity theft. Each carried potential decades behind bars. Together they formed a fortress of law that Daniel would never scale. By the time we finished, the binder was over 100 pages thick. Claire bound it in a deep blue cover, crisp white labels on the spine. It no longer looked like scraps of paper and scattered evidence. It looked like a verdict waiting to be handed down. When she slid the finished binder across the table to me, I rested my hand on it. The weight was heavy, but it wasn't just paper. It was years of trust betrayed, rebuilt into a weapon. It was proof that I was not the frail old man Daniel thought I was. I was the accountant again, the investigator, the father who had been underestimated one time too many. The weapon was ready. Now, all we needed was the stage to unleash it. The call came on a humid Thursday afternoon, while I sat on the porch, watching the tide crawl lazily across the bay. Daniel's name flashed across my phone screen, and for a moment I let it ring. I wanted him to feel the silence, to imagine me too weak, too distracted to answer. On the third ring, I picked up, my voice deliberately frail. "Dad," he said, his tone too cheerful, the kind of forced brightness that cracked at the edges. "How are you feeling? Getting stronger?" "I'm managing," I replied softly, letting a slight quaver slip into my voice. He didn't wait for me to elaborate. "Listen, I've got incredible news. Marissa and I just closed a huge deal, life-changing. We bought a new estate in Coral Gables. Infinity Poets, wine cellar, the works. It's everything we dreamed of, and we want you to see it." I could almost hear the smug grin spreading across his face, the arrogance dripping from every word. This was the mansion bought with my money, with Helena's foresight turned into his illusion of triumph. "We're throwing a housewarming in 2 weeks," he continued. "Nothing too crazy, just close friends, some business associates. We want you there. You'll be the guest of honor. Everyone needs to meet the man who made this all possible." The audacity was breathtaking. He wanted to parade me around as a prop, the proud old father smiling behind his successful son, legitimizing a castle built on fraud. For a second, rage surged hot in my chest, but I smothered it. This wasn't anger's moment. This was strategy's moment. "I don't know, Daniel," I said hesitantly. "I'm still not very strong." "Nonsense," he shot back quickly, too quickly. "It'll do you good. Fresh air, new people. You'll be proud, Dad. You'll see what I've accomplished." What he didn't realize was that he had just handed me the stage David and Claire had been waiting for. A public event filled with witnesses, cameras, and colleagues who idolized him. A perfect theater for the truth to crash down. "All right, son," I said softly, letting resignation color my words. "If it means that much to you, I'll be there." He exhaled, triumphant. "Fantastic. I'll send a car for you. This is going to be a night you'll never forget." When the call ended, I immediately dialed David and looped Claire in. I repeated the invitation word for word. There was a pause. Then David spoke, his voice low, almost reverent. "It's a gift. He just gave us the stage. A housewarming for a house built on stolen money, surrounded by his so-called friends. This is where it ends." And so, the trap was set. Not by me, but by Daniel himself. The days leading up to the party moved strangely, as though time itself was holding its breath. I played the role Daniel expected of me, the weary, recovering father, drifting through the house in silence, leaning heavily on my cane. He called often, his voice brimming with false pride, telling me about decorators, about caterers, about how the guest list was a who's who of Miami's elite. I listened, murmured polite responses, and let him believe he was dazzling me. In truth, I was memorizing every detail, every careless boast that would become part of his undoing. Meanwhile, the buyer, Mercer, grew bolder. One morning I saw a pristine white truck parked outside the estate with Mercer Development printed on its side. 3 men were out on the lawn Helena had once tended with her bare hands, setting up tripods, unfurling measuring tapes, pointing toward the seawall and the gardens. I watched from the shadows of the porch steps, hidden behind wooden beams, as they discussed where to put a fire pit, where to demolish the deck, where to pour concrete for a new infinity pool. They spoke as though I didn't exist, as though my home had already been erased. I stood there for half an hour, silent, the salt breeze carrying fragments of their arrogance to me. Demolition, expansion, luxury upgrades, words that trampled over every memory Helena and I had built in that soil. Another MO. Anne might have stormed out, shouting at them to leave, but I stayed still, letting them measure and plan, unaware that every tick of their tape was on land that legally was never theirs. Later that evening, Claire stopped by. I told her what I had seen, how Mercer's men had been carving up plans for a future that wasn't theirs to build. She didn't look alarmed. She smiled, a thin, sharp smile that reminded me of Helena. "Let them," she said. "Every dollar they spend, every blueprint they draft, it only tightens the noose around Mercer's neck. When the truth lands, he'll choke on his own arrogance." Her words settled over me like armor. I realized then that silence had become my greatest weapon. The less I said, the less I reacted, the more they revealed themselves. Daniel mistook my quiet for weakness. Mercer mistook it for defeat. Neither could see that beneath the still surface, a storm was gathering. And so, I waited. Each day was a rehearsal. Each night, a tightening coil of patience. When the party came, when the lights blazed and the music thundered, I would be there. The weak, smiling father. The silent witness. The ghost standing at the edge of his son's empire, waiting for the moment it all collapsed. The night of the party arrived like the calm before a storm. Daniel had sent a sleek black limousine to collect me, as though I were royalty being chauffeured to a coronation. To me, it felt more like a hearse. I wore an old navy blue suit Helena had once loved, the same one I had worn at my retirement dinner years ago. It was well tailored, but out of fashion, a relic from another time. I leaned on my cane, though I didn't need it as much as I pretended, and let the driver lead me into the car. The Coral Gables mansion loomed on the hillside, lit up like a monument to vanity. Glass walls glowed against the night sky, the bass of music thumping even before we reached the driveway. Guests spilled across the marble steps, sleek, tanned, dressed in clothes that screamed money, but whispered nothing of character. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, laughter too sharp, and champagne glasses raised in endless toasts. I moved slowly through the crowd, invisible, just another old man in a room full of youth and ambition. No one paid me much attention at first. Their eyes darted toward brighter lights, bigger names, shinier jewels. But then I saw him, Daniel, standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, a champagne flute in hand, Marissa glittering at his side in a silver dress. He was holding court, spinning stories to a circle of admirers, his hands gesturing grandly as though he were the king of Miami. When he spotted me, a flicker of annoyance flashed across his face before he plastered on the wide, performative smile of a showman. He strode across the room and draped an arm around my shoulders. It wasn't an embrace. It was a claim, a performance, a way of saying, "This is mine, too." "Everyone," he announced, his voice booming, "I'd like you to meet the man who made this all possible. My father, Ethan Elliott." A ripple of polite applause passed through the room, more of obligation than sincerity. Eyes turned toward me, some curious, some pitying, all calculating. To them, I was just a prop, the antique centerpiece, legitimizing Daniel's empire. "My dad taught me everything I know," Daniel continued, squeezing my shoulder. "Hard work, discipline, integrity. He built his life from nothing, and he inspired me to build mine." I smiled faintly, the weak, confused smile of an old man too tired to recognize the hypocrisy dripping from his son's lips. Inside, I was ice. Every word he spoke was another bar on the cage he was building for himself, another lie that would shatter before the night was done. I let him lead me from one group to another, introducing me to tech entrepreneurs, real estate developers, a film producer. Each time he repeated the story of the loyal son carrying on his father's legacy. Each time, I nodded, silent, letting him pile lie upon lie. What he didn't know was that the walls of his empire were already crumbling, and I was standing quietly in the center, waiting for the first crack to echo. The party swelled around me, the air thick with perfume and ambition. Waiters drifted through the crowd with trays of tiny, artful food, champagne flutes clinking like wind chimes in a storm. Daniel basked in it all, moving from group to group, his laughter booming louder than the music. I followed quietly, never speaking more than a handful of words, letting him use me like a trophy he could wave in front of his audience. Then the inevitable moment came. Daniel tapped his glass with a spoon, the sharp chime ringing out and pulling the room into silence. He stepped into the center of the vast living room, the city lights glittering behind him through the glass wall, Marissa shimmering at his side. He raised his champagne, the very picture of a man who believed he had conquered the world. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth, practiced, "thank you for coming tonight. They say success is a journey, not a destination, but tonight feels pretty damn good as a destination." The crowd chuckled dutifully. He gestured toward the mansion around him. "This house is more than just a home. It's a symbol of vision, of risk-taking, of knowing when to make a bold move, and I wouldn't be standing here without someone very special." He turned his gaze toward me, his eyes shining with false warmth. "My father," he said. "He may be from a different time, a time of caution and patience, but he taught me the value of hard work and integrity. Everything I've accomplished is because of the foundation he laid." A chorus of raised glasses echoed. "To Ethan." Their eyes turned toward me, waiting for a smile, a nod, some sign of paternal pride. I gave them nothing but the faintest curl of my lips, a frail nod, a performance in the theater of lies. And then, like a storm breaking, the great front doors of the mansion swung open. A rush of cool night air swept in, making candles flicker and silencing the room. Standing in the doorway was David Monroe, flanked by two plainclothes agents. His dark suit, his steady posture, and the badges at their belts cut through the glittering illusions like a blade. "Daniel Elliott?" David's voice wasn't loud, but it sliced through the silence with surgical precision. Daniel's smile faltered. He blinked, confused, then laughed nervously. "Yes? Can I help you? This is a private party." David stepped forward, unflinching. "My name is David Monroe. I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest, and for the arrest of your wife, Marissa Elliott." The gasp that rippled through the crowd was louder than any toast. For a moment the room was frozen, as if time itself had been stunned into silence. Dozens of eyes darted from David to Daniel, from the agents' badges to the champagne flutes trembling in their hands. Marissa's face drained of color, her diamond necklace suddenly looking like a chain around her throat. Daniel forced a laugh, the kind of brittle chuckle that dies the second it leaves the lips. "This must be some mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "I love my father. He's right here. This is absurd." But David didn't flinch. He took another step forward, his voice calm and measured. "There is no mistake, Mr. Elliott. We have traced a $12 million wire transfer from the fraudulent sale of your father's property, a sale executed with a forged signature while Mr. Elliott was unconscious and undergoing heart surgery. You are being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and elder financial abuse." The words hit the crowd like thunder. The agents moved swiftly, one taking hold of Daniel's wrist, the other stepping toward Marissa. She let out a strangled sob as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped shut around her. Daniel tried to pull back, but the fight drained from him as quickly as it had come. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw my son not as the arrogant man who thought he could steal my life, but as the frightened boy he once was, cornered, powerless, undone. The guests whispered furiously, recoiling as though betrayal were contagious. Some clutched their glasses tighter, others slipped toward the doors, eager to vanish from the wreckage of a reputation collapsing in real time. And then, from across the room, a different kind of fury surged toward me. Jonathan Mercer, red-faced, sweating, his expensive suit rumpled by the heat of his rage. He shoved through the crowd, his voice booming over the hush. "Elliott, what in God's name is the meaning of this? I have a deed. I paid $12 million for your house." I didn't move. Before I could open my mouth, Claire stepped forward, cool and composed, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a gavel striking wood. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice sharp and precise, "I am counsel for the Elliott Family Trust. What you purchased was the structure, a shell, sold through a fraudulent transaction. You did not, however, purchase the land it sits on. That land remains property of the trust. And because of the forged sale, your ground lease is void. You now have 53 days to remove your mansion from our land." The color drained from Mercer's face, as if the floor had given way beneath him. His fury collapsed into slack-jawed horror. The mighty developer had been swindled, not by me, but by his own arrogance, and by the brilliance of a woman, who had died years before, yet still protected me. The weeks that followed moved slower than tides. The party had been the storm, but the aftermath was the flood, Daniel and Marissa were paraded through hearings, their faces pale and stripped of all arrogance. The prosecutors needed no embellishment. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. The forged signatures, the bank transfers, the sworn medical affidavits. It was not a case. It was a fortress, airtight and unbreakable. Daniel, my son, who thought he could bury me before I was dead, was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Marissa, who had played her role in every lie, received 7. Their Coral Gables mansion, the cars, the jewelry, all seized, liquidated, broken apart to pay restitution. What they had built on my blood was dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but prison walls. As for Mercer, the man who believed himself untouchable, he too was trapped. Faced with the impossible choice of demolishing a $12 million mansion or cutting his losses, he was forced to the table. Claire stood across from him in a sterile conference room, her voice calm as she offered him the only way out: sell the structure back to the trust for $800,000. It was humiliating, but cheaper than the alternative. He signed, his pen trembling, the swagger drained from him. And so it came full circle. Using the very money Daniel had stolen from me, I bought back the house, the walls, the windows, the echoes of Helena's laughter, and returned it to its rightful place above the bay. Helena's fortress had held. Her foresight had saved me, and through her I had been able to stand against betrayal without lifting a weapon, only paper, law, and patience. 6 months later, I sat on the porch once more, the sun sinking low over Biscayne Bay, painting the water with streaks of gold and crimson. The house smelled of salt and cedar again, not fresh paint or fear. Claire sat beside me, a glass of iced tea in her hand, silent as the waves rolled in. For the first time since my heart surgery, I felt whole. I thought of Daniel, locked away behind steel bars. I thought of Mercer, nursing his wounds and reputation. And I thought of Helena, whose voice still whispered in my mind. The fine print is where the truth hides. She had been right all along. Justice, I realized, isn't a T, thunderclap, or a roar. It's a quiet recalibration, a balance restored, my dignity returned, my peace reclaimed, my home, once stolen, was mine again. And to you listening now, tell me in the comments, what does justice mean to you?